April 1841. South Carolina. The air was heavy with heat and humidity. The kind of heat that made the world feel slow and quiet. But that spring, something strange spread across Culleton County. Whispers. Rumors. Stories that people repeated in low voices, and only behind closed doors. Because a wealthy plantation owner had done something unthinkable. His name was Silas Rutledge. And he had just made an announcement that shocked even the cruelest men in the South. Silas Rutledge had placed his own daughter under the authority of a slave. Not as a servant. Not as a nurse. But as her master. The man's name was Ezekiel Cross. From that moment forward, Catherine Rutledge would answer to him. In a society where white women were treated like sacred symbols of power. This was unbelievable. Some people laughed. Some were horrified. Others thought Silas had lost his mind. But none of them understood what was really happening inside Cypress Grove Plantation. And none of them knew that before the year was over, 13 powerful men would be dead. And the plantation itself would burn to the ground. Cypress Grove sat beside the slow dark water of the Combahee River. 800 acres of land. Rice fields stretching as far as the eye could see. From a distance, the plantation looked beautiful. Tall white columns. Wide wooden porches. Old oak trees covered in Spanish moss. But beauty can hide terrible things. Because those fields were worked by enslaved people. Men and women forced to stand in muddy water all day. Cutting rice. Under the burning sun. Under the watch of overseers who carried whips. The wealth of Cypress Grove came from suffering. And its owner, Silas Rutledge, was very proud of it. Silas was not born into great wealth. He had built most of his fortune himself. But that wasn't enough. What he really wanted was power. He wanted to sit at the tables with the most powerful men in South Carolina. The men who owned thousands of acres. Hundreds of slaves. Men whose names could open doors, or destroy lives. Silas had spent 20 years trying to join them. Trying to prove he was worthy. Trying to earn their respect. And eventually, he found a way. Through a secret group known only as the Brethren of the Harvest. Silas had only one child. A daughter named Catherine. Her mother died the day she was born. After that, the house became a lonely place. Catherine grew up surrounded by servants and tutors. But very little love. Her father was always busy. Always chasing business deals. Always trying to impress powerful men. So Catherine spent most of her childhood alone. Reading books. Walking the gardens. Watching the world from the windows of Cypress Grove. Until one night, everything changed. She was 12 years old. And she followed her father. It was late. Long after the house had gone quiet. Catherine had heard footsteps moving downstairs. Curious. She followed them. She watched her father walk into the kitchen. Then something strange happened. He opened a hidden door behind the pantry. And disappeared down a staircase. Catherine waited a moment. Then quietly followed. The air grew colder as she stepped down into the darkness. And then she saw the cellar. Candles lit the room. 13 men stood in a circle. All wearing dark robes. In the center of the room was a wooden table. And tied to that table was a woman. Catherine froze in the shadows. She watched in silence as the men began their ritual. Strange words. Strange symbols. And then, violence. The woman screamed. But no one helped her. And Catherine saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Among those men was her father, Silas Rutledge. When it was over, the men did something even worse. Something Catherine would never forget. They sat down together and began to eat. The next morning Catherine tried to tell someone. Anyone. But no one believed her. Her father said she had a nightmare. The doctors said she was hysterical. And slowly, they began giving her medicine. Strong medicine. Laudanum. Mercury tonics. Sedatives. At first Catherine resisted. But over time, the drugs clouded her mind. She gained weight. She became slow. Unsteady. Sometimes she screamed. Sometimes she threw things. And soon the entire county believed the same story. Poor Catherine Rutledge. The mad daughter of Cypress Grove. But Catherine knew the truth. She was not mad. She had simply seen something no one else was meant to see. Years passed. Then one day, a letter arrived for Silas Rutledge. It carried the seal of the Brethren of the Harvest. Inside the letter was a warning. Silas owed them money. A lot of money. More than he could ever repay. If he failed to pay, his life would be destroyed. But there was another option. A test of loyalty. A humiliation so great that it would prove his devotion to the Brethren. Silas would place his daughter under the authority of a slave. For 1 full year. If he agreed, his debts would disappear. Silas spent the entire night thinking about it. About his reputation. His wealth. His future. And by morning, he had made his choice. He signed the letter. 3 days later, a wagon arrived at Cypress Grove. Inside the wagon sat a tall man with calm eyes. His name was Ezekiel Cross. He had been purchased from a plantation in Virginia. Silas stepped onto the porch to inspect him. Most enslaved men avoided eye contact. They kept their heads down. But Ezekiel didn't. He looked directly at Silas. Quiet. Calm. Watching. Silas felt something strange in that moment. Something he rarely felt. Unease. Because what he didn't know was that 3 years earlier, he had sold Ezekiel's wife and children. Torn them away. Sent them to another plantation, where they died soon after. And since that day, Ezekiel Cross had been waiting for the chance to face the man who destroyed his family. Now, he was standing right in front of him. Inside his house. Inside his world. And very soon, everything Silas Rutledge had built would begin to fall apart. The wagon rolled away, leaving Ezekiel standing alone in the yard of Cypress Grove. For a moment, everything was quiet. The wind moved slowly through the oak trees. Spanish moss swayed like gray curtains in the warm air. But Ezekiel wasn't looking at the trees. He was looking at the house. The white columns. The wide porch. The windows staring down at him like silent witnesses. 3 years earlier, a man from this house had taken everything from him. His wife. His son. His little girl. And now fate had brought him here. Not as a visitor. Not as a free man. But as property. Silas Rutledge stepped down from the porch and walked toward him. The plantation owner was thin, almost gaunt. His gray hair made him look older than he was. But his eyes were sharp. Cold. Calculating. So, Silas said slowly, studying him. You're the healer. Ezekiel nodded slightly. My grandmother taught me herbs, sir. Silas stared at him for a moment longer. Most enslaved men avoided eye contact. But Ezekiel's eyes stayed steady. That bothered Silas more than he wanted to admit. Finally he waved a hand. "You'll start your duties tomorrow." A pause. "You'll be responsible for my daughter." The way he said it carried no warmth. No concern. Just irritation. As if Catherine Rutledge were a problem he wanted someone else to fix. A house slave named Judith stepped forward. She was older, her hair streaked with gray. "Come with me," she said quietly to Ezekiel. They walked across the yard toward a small cabin near the house. Inside was a narrow bed, a table, and a small wooden chair. Nothing more. Judith lingered by the door. "You should be careful," she whispered. "Miss Catherine, she ain't like other people." Ezekiel met her eyes. "How so?" Judith hesitated. "Some days she screams. Throws things. Breaks glass." Another pause. "Other days she just sits by the window, like she ain't even here." She lowered her voice further. "The doctors filled her with medicine for years. Laudanum mostly." Ezekiel felt a cold knot in his stomach. Laudanum. That explained a lot. Judith looked toward the house nervously. "Whatever you do, don't anger Master Rutledge." Then she left. Ezekiel sat on the edge of the bed and reached inside his shirt. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper. 3 names written carefully in faded ink. Sarah. Benjamin. Ruth. His wife. His son. His daughter. For a long moment he stared at those names. Then he whispered quietly into the empty room. "I'm here now." The next morning arrived heavy with heat. Judith led him through the big house. Cypress Grove looked impressive on the outside. But inside, it felt cold. Empty. The walls were covered in paintings and expensive furniture. But something about the place felt wrong. Like the house itself was holding its breath. They stopped outside a large door upstairs. Judith knocked gently. "Miss Catherine, the healer is here." A crash exploded from inside the room. Something heavy slammed against the wall. Then a voice shouted from within. "I said I don't want another doctor." Judith winced. "She's having a bad morning." Ezekiel stepped forward. "Open the door." Judith hesitated. Then slowly pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Stale air. Sweat. Medicine. The room was a disaster. Curtains drawn shut. Books scattered across the floor. Broken glass near the fireplace. And sitting in a large chair near the window was Catherine Rutledge. Her dark hair hung loose and tangled. Her face looked swollen. Her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the arms of the chair. But her eyes. Her eyes were sharp. Too sharp for someone supposedly mad. She stared at Ezekiel. "Who are you?" "My name is Ezekiel. I don't want another doctor." "I'm not a doctor." Silence filled the room. Catherine studied him carefully. "You're a slave." "Yes." She frowned. "My father sent you?" "Yes." Catherine laughed suddenly. A harsh sound. "Of course he did." She leaned back in her chair. "Tell him his little experiment failed." Ezekiel didn't move. Instead he walked slowly to the window. Then he pulled the curtains open. Bright sunlight flooded the room. Catherine cried out and shielded her eyes. "Stop." But Ezekiel didn't stop. He turned back toward her calmly. "When was the last time you left this room?" Catherine blinked against the light. "I can't walk that far." "You can." "No. You can." Something in his voice made her pause. Then she said quietly. "You don't understand." Ezekiel stepped closer. I understand medicine. Her eyes narrowed. And I understand poisoning. The room went completely still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine whispered. What did you say? You've been given laudanum for years. Ezekiel's voice stayed calm. Too much of it. Doctors prescribed it. Doctors can be wrong. She stared at him. Fear and hope flickering together in her eyes. You're lying. No. You're testing me. I'm helping you. Silence stretched between them. Finally Catherine asked quietly. Why? Ezekiel hesitated. Then he told the truth. Because your father destroyed my family. The words hung in the air. Catherine's expression changed slowly. The anger faded. The madness faded. What remained was something colder. Tell me. Ezekiel spoke quietly. He sold my wife and my children to another plantation. They died there. A long pause followed. Then Catherine nodded slowly. The brethren. Ezekiel felt a chill run through him. You know about them? Catherine laughed softly. I know everything about them. She stood slowly from the chair. Her legs shook slightly. But she stayed standing. When I was 12, she said quietly. I watched my father murder a woman in the cellar. Ezekiel didn't speak. He just listened. They cut pieces from her body, Catherine continued. And afterward. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They ate. Tears filled her eyes. But when I told people, they said I was insane. Her hands clenched into fists. They drugged me. They locked me in this room. They spent 16 years convincing everyone that I was mad. She looked directly at Ezekiel. But I remember everything. For the first time. Ezekiel felt something shift inside him. This woman wasn't broken. She was dangerous. Then Catherine asked the question that changed everything. Do you want revenge? Ezekiel didn't answer right away. But he didn't need to. She could see it in his eyes. Catherine stepped closer. Her voice became calm. Cold. Good. She looked toward the floor. Toward the cellar beneath the house. Because I want them all dead. Catherine didn't look away. The words she had just spoken hung in the air like thunder before a storm. I want them all dead. For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside, somewhere in the fields, a distant shout echoed from the rice workers. Life on the plantation continued as if nothing had changed. But inside that room, everything had. Ezekiel studied her carefully. Her hands were still trembling slightly from the years of medicine. But her eyes were clear. Focused. Not the eyes of a madwoman. The eyes of someone who had been waiting. Waiting a very long time. Finally Ezekiel spoke quietly. You're weak. Catherine gave a small smile. Yes. Years of laudanum will do that, he continued. But weakness can be cured. She tilted her head. And revenge? Ezekiel's voice dropped lower. Revenge requires patience. For the first time in years. Catherine laughed softly. Not the wild laugh people in the house were used to hearing. But something calmer. Something real. Good, she said. Because patience is the only thing I've had for 16 years. Silence filled the room again. Then Catherine turned toward the door. Come with me. Judith was still waiting in the hallway when they stepped outside. The older woman's eyes widened immediately. Miss Catherine, you're standing. Catherine looked at her gently. Judith. I need the house keys. Judith froze. Your father keeps them. I know. Another pause. But he trusts you with the cellar key. Judith's face went pale. You shouldn't go down there. Catherine's voice softened. Judith. The older woman hesitated. Then slowly, she reached into her apron and pulled out a small iron key. Her hands were shaking when she gave it to Catherine. Be careful. Catherine nodded once. Then she started down the staircase. Ezekiel followed. Each step creaked beneath their weight as they descended toward the lower floor of the house. The air grew colder. Thicker. Until finally they reached the pantry. Catherine walked straight to the back wall. Then she moved a large wooden shelf aside. Behind it was the door. The same door she had seen as a child. The hidden staircase leading down into darkness. Ezekiel felt something heavy settle in his chest. Are you sure about this? Catherine didn't answer. She simply unlocked the door. The iron hinge groaned as it opened. And the smell came rushing out. Old candles. Rot. Something darker. They stepped carefully down the narrow stone staircase. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a wide chamber. The candles were gone now. But the room still held their memory. Symbols carved into the wooden beams. Dark stains on the floor. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. What is this place? Catherine whispered the answer. This is where they meet. She walked slowly toward the center of the room. There are 13 of them. Plantation owners. Judges. Bankers. Men who control half this county. Her voice grew colder with each word. They call themselves the Brethren of the Harvest. Ezekiel looked around the room. And they do this here? Yes. How often? 4 times a year. His eyes narrowed. And your father? He hosts the meetings. The silence that followed felt heavy. Then Catherine walked toward a large wooden cabinet against the wall. She opened it slowly. Inside were stacks of papers. Ledgers. Letters sealed with wax. Records. Ezekiel stepped closer. What are these? Catherine picked up one of the books and opened it. These men believe their power comes from blood. But power also comes from secrets. She turned the book toward him. Names filled the pages. Dates. Transactions. Payments. Threats. Bribes. Evidence of crime stretching back decades. Ezekiel realized what he was looking at. This could destroy them. Catherine nodded slowly. Yes. Then her voice became darker. But destroying them isn't enough. She closed the ledger. They ruined hundreds of lives. They sold families. They murdered people. They built their wealth on suffering. She looked straight at Ezekiel. So they don't deserve prison. Ezekiel understood what she meant. And when is the next meeting? Catherine answered immediately. 3 weeks. Ezekiel took a slow breath. 3 weeks. That wasn't long. But it might be enough. How many guards will be here? He asked. None. He frowned. None. They believe no one knows about the cellar. She smiled slightly. And they believe I'm insane. For a moment. Ezekiel almost smiled too. Then Catherine walked deeper into the cellar. She stopped beside the old wooden table. The same table where she had watched a woman die. Her fingers brushed across the dark stains in the wood. I remember her screaming, she whispered. Ezekiel didn't speak. I remember my father watching. Her voice trembled. But he never looked afraid. Slowly, she lifted her head. But he will. Ezekiel stepped beside her. 13 men. Yes. And you want all of them? Yes. Another long silence passed. Then Ezekiel asked quietly, "Are you ready for what that will make you?" Catherine looked directly into his eyes. For the first time since he arrived, the madness people spoke about appeared again. But now Ezekiel understood. It wasn't madness. It was rage. 16 years of it. "I crossed that line a long time ago," she said. Above them, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. Both of them froze. Someone was moving upstairs. Catherine whispered quickly, "My father." Ezekiel looked toward the staircase. "How long until he knows you're out of your room?" "Soon. Then we leave." But before they turned away, Catherine reached inside the cabinet again. This time she pulled out a small leather book. Much smaller than the others. Ezekiel noticed the names written on its first page. All 13 members of the Brethren. At the very bottom was one final name. Silas Rutledge. Catherine closed the book slowly. "This," she said quietly, "is the order they die in." Footsteps echoed above them. Heavy. Slow. Silas Rutledge was moving across the floor of the house. Catherine and Ezekiel stood frozen in the darkness of the cellar. Every creak of the wood above their heads sounded louder than it should have. Catherine leaned closer and whispered, "We have to go." Ezekiel nodded. They moved quickly toward the staircase, the small leather book hidden beneath Catherine's shawl. By the time they stepped back into the pantry, the house was silent again. But the silence felt different now. Dangerous. Judith was waiting near the kitchen table, wringing her hands nervously. "Miss Catherine, your father is looking for you." Catherine's face changed instantly. The calm expression disappeared. Her shoulders slumped. Her hands began trembling again. The madness returned like a mask sliding back into place. Ezekiel watched carefully. It was an act. And it was very convincing. Silas Rutledge stepped into the kitchen just seconds later. His eyes widened the moment he saw Catherine standing there. "You're out of your room." Catherine laughed suddenly. A sharp, strange sound. "I wanted to see the sunshine, Father." Silas looked irritated. Then he looked at Ezekiel. "So the healer thinks he can cure madness now?" Ezekiel lowered his eyes slightly. "I'm only trying to help her walk again, sir." Silas studied Catherine closely. For a moment, suspicion flickered across his face. But Catherine suddenly began humming softly to herself while staring at the ceiling. Silas sighed. Pathetic. He turned back to Ezekiel. "You will keep her under control." "Yes, sir." "And remember something." Silas stepped closer, his voice cold. "If she embarrasses me, I will hold you responsible." Ezekiel didn't answer. Silas left the room moments later. His footsteps faded down the hallway. Only then did Catherine stop humming. Her eyes immediately became clear again. "That man," she whispered, "has spent half his life pretending to be powerful." Ezekiel looked toward the doorway. "And the other half?" "Being afraid someone will discover the truth." Judith slowly approached them. "You shouldn't provoke him." Catherine touched the small book hidden beneath her shawl. "It's too late for that." Judith's eyes filled with worry. "What are you planning?" Catherine looked at Ezekiel. Then back at Judith. "We're going to end the Brethren." Judith gasped quietly. "You can't fight men like them." Catherine's voice softened. "No. But we can make them destroy themselves." That night, the storm arrived. Thunder rolled across the fields. Rain hammered the roof of Cypress Grove. Most of the plantation slept through it. But 2 people stayed awake. In the small cabin behind the house. Ezekiel sat at the table with the leather book open in front of him. A single candle flickered beside it. 13 names. 13 powerful men. Men who owned plantations. Men who controlled courts. Men who believed themselves untouchable. Ezekiel traced the first name with his finger. Thomas Barrow. A rice merchant. Rich. Greedy. And according to the ledger, deeply in debt. The door opened quietly. Catherine stepped inside wearing a dark cloak. Rainwater dripped from the fabric. "You shouldn't be here," Ezekiel said. "My father drinks himself to sleep every night," she replied calmly. She stepped closer and looked at the book. "Barrow." "Yes." Catherine nodded. "He's the weakest one." Ezekiel looked up. "Explain." Catherine pulled out a folded paper. "My father keeps correspondence from the brethren." She placed the letter on the table. "The next meeting is in 3 weeks." Ezekiel already knew that part. But then she continued. "Barrow has been stealing money from them." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "How much?" "Enough that they would kill him if they knew." A long silence followed. Then Ezekiel slowly began to understand. "You want them to suspect each other." Catherine smiled slightly. "Yes. They believe their power comes from loyalty." She leaned closer to the candlelight. "So we remove that loyalty." Outside, thunder cracked across the sky. Ezekiel closed the ledger. "And when they turn on each other?" Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then we finish what they started." The rain continued through most of the night. By morning, the fields were flooded with muddy water. Workers moved slowly through the rice paddies. Overseers shouted from horseback. Life on Cypress Grove looked exactly the same. But beneath the surface, something had begun. Later that afternoon, Ezekiel walked into town. Silas had sent him to purchase medical supplies. But Ezekiel had another purpose. The town of Culleton was small. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone talked. Inside the general store, men gathered around a wooden table playing cards. Among them sat Thomas Barrow. A large man with sweating skin and nervous eyes. Ezekiel stepped quietly to the counter. But Barrow noticed him. "What's a plantation slave doing in here alone?" Ezekiel kept his voice calm. "Buying supplies for Master Rutledge." Barrow snorted. "Rutledge always thought he was better than the rest of us." The other men laughed. Barrow leaned back in his chair. "You work for him long?" "Just arrived." Barrow took another drink from his glass. "Then take some advice." He leaned forward slightly. "Stay away from his business." Ezekiel looked confused. "What business?" Barrow smiled in a way that felt wrong. "The kind that happens at night." For a moment, the room felt colder. Barrow studied Ezekiel carefully. Then he chuckled. "Don't worry. You people never understand what's really happening." Ezekiel picked up the bag of supplies from the counter. But before leaving, he said something quietly. "Some people understand more than you think." Barrow's smile faded. But Ezekiel was already walking toward the door. Back at Cypress Grove that evening, Catherine waited near the garden. "What did you learn?" she asked. Ezekiel handed her the supply bag. "Barrow is nervous." "Good. He suspects something already." Catherine looked toward the house. "Then we give him something worse to fear." Ezekiel crossed his arms. "And that is?" Catherine slowly pulled another letter from her cloak. A blank sheet of paper. She dipped a pen into ink. Then began writing carefully. When she finished, she handed it to him. The message was short. 3 simple lines. We know what you stole. The brethren will judge you soon. Confess before the next gathering, or face the consequences. Ezekiel read the letter. Then looked up at her. This will terrify him. That's the point. And when he panics. Catherine's eyes turn toward the dark plantation house. Then the brethren will start asking questions. Thunder rumbled again in the distance. Ezekiel realized something in that moment. The revenge Catherine wanted wasn't quick. It wasn't reckless. It was careful. Strategic. Piece by piece. She intended to tear the brethren apart. And when the time came for the final meeting, those 13 men would walk into the cellar believing they were the hunters. But they wouldn't realize the truth. They had already become the prey. The letter was delivered 2 nights later. No one saw who placed it. No one saw the shadow that slipped through the streets of Culloden after midnight. But by morning, Thomas Barrow had received it. And everything began to change. Ezekiel noticed it first. 3 days later he returned to town with another supply order from Silas Rutledge. The general store was quieter than usual. Men spoke in low voices. The card table was empty. Barrow was sitting alone near the window. And he looked different. Sweat covered his forehead even though the day was cool. His hands shook slightly as he poured whiskey into a glass. Ezekiel pretended not to notice. But Barrow noticed him. "Hey, you." Ezekiel stopped. Barrow waved him closer. "Come here." Ezekiel walked slowly toward the table. Barrow leaned forward, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "You work for Rutledge, right?" "Yes." Barrow lowered his voice. "Has anyone been asking questions?" Ezekiel frowned slightly. "What kind of questions?" Barrow swallowed. "About me." The fear in his voice was real now. Ezekiel looked confused. "I wouldn't know, sir." Barrow stared at him for a long moment. Then leaned even closer. "You ever hear of a group called, the Brethren?" Ezekiel paused. Just for a second. Long enough for Barrow to notice. But short enough to look natural. "No." Barrow leaned back slowly. Relief and fear mixing together on his face. "Good." He finished his drink. Then whispered to himself. "Maybe it's just a trick." Ezekiel picked up the supply bag. But before leaving, he said quietly. "Sometimes the worst thing isn't being guilty." Barrow looked up. "What?" Ezekiel met his eyes calmly. "It's knowing someone else knows." Then he walked out of the store. Barrow didn't touch his drink again after that. Back at Cypress Grove. Catherine was waiting under the large oak tree near the garden. When Ezekiel approached, she studied his expression. "Well?" "He's terrified." A small smile appeared on her face. "Good. He thinks the brethren discovered his theft." Catherine nodded slowly. "That means he'll do one of 2 things." "What?" "He'll run." She paused. "Or he'll betray them first." Ezekiel crossed his arms. "And which do you want?" Catherine looked toward the plantation house. "The second one." The sun began to sink behind the rice fields. Workers slowly returned to their cabins. The overseers rode past on horseback shouting orders. But Catherine barely noticed any of it. Her mind was somewhere else. "Tomorrow night," she said quietly. "What happens tomorrow night?" "My father has visitors." Ezekiel looked at her. "Members of the Brethren?" "3 of them." "Who?" Catherine thought for a moment. "Judge Whittaker. Samuel Dunning. And Thomas Barrow." Ezekiel's eyes narrowed. "All 3 in the same room?" "Yes." A slow silence followed. Then Catherine looked at him. Fear makes men careless. Ezekiel understood immediately. You want Barrow to reveal himself. Catherine nodded. He'll be desperate. And desperate men talk too much. That night, Ezekiel couldn't sleep. The cabin felt smaller than usual. The air heavy. The storm clouds from earlier had returned. Thunder rolled quietly across the sky. He sat at the table, staring at the leather book again. 13 names. One of them was about to crack. But revenge, once started, rarely stopped where people expected. And Ezekiel knew something Catherine might not. When powerful men feel threatened, they become monsters. The next evening, the brethren arrived. 3 carriages rolled into Cypress Grove just after sunset. Servants rushed to open doors. Silas Rutledge greeted his guests on the porch with a wide smile. From the garden, Catherine watched everything. Ezekiel stood beside her in the shadows. Judge Whittaker stepped out first. Tall. Thin. His sharp face always looked like he was smelling something unpleasant. Samuel Dunning followed. A wealthy banker known for crushing anyone who owed him money. And finally, Thomas Barrow. The moment he stepped out of the carriage, Catherine noticed it. His hands were shaking again. Ezekiel saw it too. Fear, he whispered. Catherine nodded. Good. The 3 men entered the house. Dinner lasted nearly 2 hours. Laughter echoed through the windows. Glasses clinked. The sound of men who believed they controlled the world. But eventually, the mood changed. Catherine and Ezekiel moved quietly toward the back hallway. From there, they could hear everything inside the dining room. At first the conversation was casual. Business. Politics. Money. Then suddenly, Barrow spoke. His voice sounded strained. Have either of you received strange letters? The room went silent. Catherine glanced at Ezekiel. Judge Whittaker answered first. What kind of letters? Barrow hesitated. Threats. Dunning laughed. You're drunk. No. Barrow slammed his glass onto the table. I'm serious. Silence filled the room again. Then Whittaker's voice turned colder. Explain. Barrow swallowed. Someone knows about the brethren. That sentence changed everything. Catherine could hear the tension in the room now. Dunning spoke next. That's impossible. Barrow's voice cracked. Then how did they know I took the money? Silence exploded across the dining room. Catherine's eyes widened slightly. Barrow had just confessed. Whittaker spoke slowly. You did what? Barrow realized his mistake instantly. But it was too late. I only borrowed it. Dunning stood from his chair. You stole from us? Barrow's voice became desperate. I was going to return it. Whittaker's chair scraped against the floor. You fool. Catherine could almost hear the hatred in his voice. If the others find out. Barrow interrupted him. They already know. That sentence hung in the air like a gunshot. Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. Because this was exactly what Catherine wanted. The brethren were turning on each other. Inside the dining room, the argument exploded. Shouting. Accusations. Threats. But Catherine slowly stepped away from the door. Her expression calm. Cold. Ezekiel followed her back into the garden. Behind them, the shouting inside the house grew louder. They're tearing each other apart, Ezekiel said. Catherine looked up at the dark sky. Not yet. Thunder rumbled in the distance again. This is only the beginning. Ezekiel studied her face carefully. And when the others find out? Catherine turned back toward the glowing windows of the house. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Then the brethren will stop trusting each other. And when that happens? Another crash echoed from the dining room. A chair falling. More shouting. Catherine finished the sentence quietly. They'll walk into the cellar already afraid. And frightened men. Her eyes grew darker. Make terrible mistakes. The argument inside the house didn't stop for a long time. Voices rose. Chairs scraped. Glass shattered against the floor. From the garden, Catherine and Ezekiel could hear every angry word spilling through the open windows. Thomas Barrow had made a terrible mistake. And now the other two men were circling him like wolves. Thief, Samuel Dunning spat from inside. I told you we never should have trusted him, Judge Whittaker added. Barrow's voice sounded desperate now. You don't understand. Someone sent me a letter. A lie, Dunning snapped. No. Barrow slammed his hand on the table. They know everything. Silence followed. The kind of silence that only comes when fear enters the room. Catherine slowly turned toward Ezekiel. It worked. But Ezekiel didn't look relieved. He looked thoughtful. They're scared now. That was the point. Yes, he said quietly. But scared men are dangerous. Inside the house, the front door suddenly burst open. Barrow stormed out onto the porch. His face was pale. His breathing uneven. Moments later Whittaker and Dunning followed him outside. Barrow pointed at them wildly. You think I'm the only one hiding things? Whittaker's voice became ice cold. You should stop talking. No, Barrow shouted. You think the others don't know what you've done? Dunning stepped forward. You're drunk. Barrow laughed bitterly. No. I'm just the only one telling the truth. The tension between them felt ready to explode. Catherine watched carefully from the shadows. Every detail mattered. Every reaction. Whittaker finally stepped closer to Barrow. You will attend the next gathering, he said quietly. And you will explain yourself to the brethren. Barrow's eyes widened. You're going to kill me. Whittaker didn't answer. But his silence was enough. Barrow staggered backward. You're all the same, he muttered. Then he climbed into his carriage and left the plantation. His horse galloped down the road into the darkness. Whittaker and Dunning stood on the porch watching him disappear. Dunning spoke first. He's unstable. Whittaker nodded slowly. Yes. Should we inform the others? Whittaker thought for a moment. No. Why not? Because panic spreads. He turned toward the house. We deal with Barrow at the next meeting. The two men returned inside. Catherine exhaled slowly. That's exactly what we needed. Ezekiel studied her. You pushed one man into a corner. Yes. And now? Now he'll panic. Thunder rolled across the sky again. The storm was coming back. 2 days later, the panic began. Thomas Barrow did not sleep. Every shadow felt like someone watching him. Every knock at the door made his heart race. The letter Catherine had written had planted a seed in his mind. And fear watered it. By the third night, Barrow finally broke. He sent a message. Not to the brethren. To someone else. A federal investigator in Charleston. Barrow asked for protection. And in exchange, he promised to reveal everything. The secret meetings. The crimes. The murders. The brethren of the harvest. The investigator agreed to meet him. But Barrow never made it. Late that same night, a carriage stopped outside his house. 3 men stepped out. No one saw their faces clearly. But the town would later remember one detail. One of them carried a silver cane. The same kind Judge Whittaker always carried. By morning, Thomas Barrow was dead.